Ireland is a nation whose rich background is embodied in conflict, beauty, genocide, resilience, hardship, and perseverance. Despite a collective history that so regularly put our ancestors on the ropes, bloodied and battered, often leaving them feeling dehumanised from the horrors of their past, Ireland always found a way to get back to its feet before the 10 count, beaten, but never broken. It's only natural that a people who often rolled with life's punches and showed such cheeky grit in the face of adversity would create shockwaves around the world and become garnered with such sayings as the fighting Irish or the luck of the Irish. The warrior Irish spirit and that of a group of people capable of manoeuvring out of tricky situations are two things which are entirely synonymous with the Irish legacy. From revered warriors to grandeur poets to idealist visionaries, Ireland has always had a steady output of good men who loved their nation and her people, a steady output of men who were always willing to fight the good fight for their country and kin, or to simply do that which was required of them. Renowned men like the Fianna, Brian Boru, Daniel O'Connell, Wolfe Tone, Padraig Pearse, Michael Collins and Bobby Sands. These were men of action with a moral cause, but unfortunately such a rich history of perpetual resilience beneath the jackboot of a foreign empire doesn't come without a cost. Ireland has also had an arguably higher output of lesser men, men who have and who would happily sell their contemporaries down the river to the highest bidder out of personal greed, selfish fear or just cold apathy. I'm talking about the conniving charlatans, Turncloaks and cute Hoors that have continually held office since the aftermath of the War of Independence, a period of time in which we tragically lost most of our greats. I'm talking about selfish elites who merely care for saving their own hides and for what their superiors think. I'm talking about weak men of a subservient nature. Fortunately, Irish history is bolstered with examples that we can recall on to discuss this juxtaposition of the two conflicting psyches. After all, as stated, we've had plenty of both types of men. However, a more recent example in our long history that would suffice perfectly to showcase both psyches of the Irish mind would be that of the Siege of Jadotville in 1961. The Siege of Jadotville is the incredible true story of a 5-day-long battle that took place in the former Katanga province of Congo in the heart of Sub Saharan Africa. 155 Irish UN peacekeeping troops known as A Company 35th Battalion were tasked with the defence of the mining town of Jadotville, some 100 kilometres from their main base in Elizabethville. However, when they arrived, they realised immediately the anti-UN sentiment the locals held and just how ill-equipped they and their compound was, being out in the open, possessing only light personal weapons, a few Vickers machine guns and some 60mm mortars. Fortunately, the quick-witted commandant Pat Quinlan, a Kerry native, ordered his men to dig trenches upon arrival to secure an appropriate defence perimeter of the village. This single action alone saved the lives of every single Irishman there, as shortly after, a 3,000-strong Katangese force made up of both French and Belgian mercenaries as well as local Luba tribesmen began attacking the 35th Battalion in waves of 600. Despite being heavily unprepared in terms of equipment and experience, this young battalion of brave Irishmen, outnumbered 20-1, stood their ground under superior firepower and mortar strikes from the much larger and more experienced enemy forces. A Company, many of whom were still teenagers, successfully defended their position for 5 days, even knocking out Katangi's field guns and mortar positions with successful counter-battery fire from their own 60mm mortars. In the midst of all of this, the young Irishmen found their positions under attack and their transport vehicles destroyed from an enemy Fauga Magister trainer jet, essentially leaving a breakout impossible. Several days into the battle, it was obvious that despite this onslaught, the UN troops had not been demoralised, having radioed into HQ, "We will fight until our last bullet is spent." Could do with some whiskey. Reinforcements attempted to break through to A Company but were successfully repelled at a pinch point on the Lafera bridge by Katangi's forces. An air supply of water was successful in reaching the men in Jadotville. However, having arrived in unwashed petrol cans, it turned out to be undrinkable. At this stage, the Irishmen led by Quinlan were lacking any communication and direction from higher command, had no ammunition or food, and little water left. They found themselves forced into a position of accepting a second surrender offered by the opposing forces, who they themselves had found their numbers severely diminishing. By Sunday 17th September, with up to 300 mercenaries killed in action and up to 1,000 more wounded, the Irish receiving no killed in actions themselves and having only 5 wounded, the fighting was over. Eventually, after a month of being held captive, the Irishmen of A Company were released, having been bartered for prisoners with the Congolese government, at which point they returned to their base in Elizabethville. They finished out their 6-month tour by December of 1961 and were rotated home. Commandant Quinlan and his brave young men clearly possessed the very positive, selfless and courageous characteristics of Irishmen to which I alluded to in the prologue of this video. And you'd think that upon their arrival home, men of this stock would have made national news and been marched up and down O'Connell Street for the heroism they showed in the face of imminent death, for putting all fears aside and simply doing their duty in an unbelievably high-pressured situation. But unfortunately you'd be wrong. The reason being is because of men of the other stock that I also spoke of at the beginning of this video. Cowardly, self-serving snakes that care not for what's best for the many, but only for what preserves their careers and fragile egos. Weak, snivelling men like Conor Cruise O'Brien. O'Brien, a native Dubliner, was selected to be the UN senior diplomat on the ground during the Congo crisis and subsequently during the Siege of Jadotville itself. He came from a privileged background, being the son of a father who wrote for the Freeman's Journal and Irish Independent, and of a mother who was an Irish teacher and a hardline feminist. Cruise O'Brien received a thorough education, eventually going on to Trinity College Dublin, where he would be elected a scholar in modern languages in 1937. Up until he was handed the difficult task of dealing with the Congo crisis, Cruise O'Brien was already an established diplomat and widely associated among global aristocrats, having taken a vocal role at the UN General Assembly in New York before finding himself being appointed out in the Congo. Being the highly career-orientated man he was, it's natural to see that when he took control of the UN's ground troops in the Congo that he would opt for a more peace enforcer role rather than peacekeeping, hoping to stem the chaos deriving in the Katangese province, thus gaining him the desired credit as the man who solved the Congo crisis. However, when this backfired on him, getting 155 of his own countrymen taken captive and being forced into a position to barter prisoners, Cruise O'Brien and the Irish government couldn't sweep this situation under the rug fast enough. Having an uncle myself, who was one of the brave men besieged in Jadotville, I take great pride in the history of the battle itself. However, I harbour much disdain to the government and Cruise O'Brien because what should have been a tearful welcoming home ceremony for all troops turned into a case of, let's just pretend this didn't happen, whereby the reputation of the few elites took precedence over the much needed, attentive readjustment of the many back into their society. For years the government and Irish Defence Forces refused to acknowledge the battle, despite Commandant Quinlan himself recommending several of his men for the Military Medal of Gallantry, Ireland's highest award for military valour. This was most likely due to the political and strategic errors made by higher-ups like Cruise O'Brien, who in the cover-up of it all sought only to preserve his ego and future political career, thus rendering obsolete any positive reassurance for the troops in their heroic actions, which most certainly led to them tactically defeating a much larger enemy force without suffering as much as one loss of life themselves. So what did await the now many PTSD-induced veterans was shame, depression, alcoholism, and in 5 cases, suicide. In a book written by Sebastian Younger named Tribe, he speaks of the overwhelming importance of a sense of understanding that war veterans need to feel from their people upon returning home. And this is necessary in order to help stem off the inevitable feeling of psychological alienation that many vets feel due to what they saw, experienced, or had to do in order to survive. Not only understanding, but many veterans need to feel useful and that there is a genuine purpose for them in their community long after they come home. But because of the cowardice and selfishness of the likes of O'Brien and the subservient fear he felt for what his superiors would think, Quinlan and his men were made feel alienated upon their return home, and that all they endured was for nothing. Tragically, many veterans, my own uncle included, passed away before they rightfully received official recognition for the battle in 2017. It's terrific that they finally received the much needed acknowledgement 55 years later, but unfortunately for many, it was too little too late. The wound was there and had long since festered. So to recap on everything that was discussed, it's obvious that we've had both a lot of good and bad come from our island. Commandant Quinlan and his men being the very embodiment of the quick-witted and defiant nature many Irishmen and women possess, always wearing their hearts on their sleeve, often accepting a situation as brutal as it may be and still finding a way to get the job done in the most audacious of fashion. Conor Cruise O'Brien, however, is the exact embodiment of that of a turncloak, a subservient and self-serving snake in the grass who was excessively conceited and completely absorbed in his own personal interests. To take it further, when the Troubles kicked off in 1969, O'Brien done a complete 180 on his political views, from once upon a time speaking quite boldly on the partition of the island from a nationalist perspective. He now couldn't condemn nationalism quick enough, as he now jumped on board the unionist bandwagon, even imposing censorship on RTE, and in 1976 banning any Sinn Féin spokesperson from RTE. Following this, he even attempted to replace Ireland's second proposed TV channel run by RTE with BBC One. Tomás McSimon, in his book The Broken Harp, Identity and Language in Modern Ireland, discusses in detail the inferiority complex that the citizens of many post-colonial nations such as Ireland possess. Partially this comes from losing our native tongue and being forced to view and interpret the world through an Anglo lens. However, there is much to be said for the generational trauma that gets passed down from generation to generation as a result of hundreds of years of oppression and subservience, which inevitably leads to many feeling a need for a codependency with a big other in order to thrive, and showing great indifference towards their own people or culture, thus identifying with their colonisers in an almost Stockholm Syndrome-like fashion, similarly to the actions of Cruz O'Brien, as stated just moments ago. This is clearly a prominent occurrence throughout recent Irish history if you consider the fact that upon finally achieving independence, the power vacuum created by the British Crown essentially moved on to the Catholic Church, as society now looked for another entity to guide the way. Then decades later in the 70s, Ireland joined the EEC, although while much more different at the time, eventually evolved into the current EU superstate we have today. And now Ireland can't adopt fast enough whatever the latest global trend is, whether it's the LGBTQ culture and forcing it into every corner of its society, legalising abortion, or the mass migration of the third world into Ireland through the Ireland 2040 plan. It would appear that although we've had many positive cornerstone examples of the Irish spirit and its people pop up throughout history, ultimately we've often been steered off course from truly finding our own sense of direction together as a nation, and instead find ourselves being influenced by the power and ethos of an external entity and developing the conceited subservience that comes with it, as seen especially among the political elites. As I mentioned in the beginning, we've always found a way back to our feet before the 10 count, and I do feel that we can get a grip on our government's all too frequent austerity towards its own people. The Irish people have slowly been waking up and getting active in their various forms of grassroots movements. Although the struggle is still met with groups of useful idiots, the nationalist movement, which encourages and protects every positive fibre of Irishness, is gaining momentum. And in these current times, where the subservience of the few outweigh the interests of the many, it's important to reflect upon the boldness and integrity of the great Irishmen and women and their love for Ireland, and realise that these are the very characteristics which brought about her independence. This is the encapsulation of the Irish spirit at its very best.